Gazing up at the stars, Michael took in the beautiful sights along the side of the well-tended road. With the whoosh above the treetops carrying the form of the largest bird veiled in darkness he had ever seen. Minutes later, a young man covered in blood would rush throughout the camp, waking up his traveling companions. This September would be a lifelong nightmare for Michael and his friends, but shed light on a string of unsolved murders spanning a decade. But before we pack our bags to hike the Lechman Path, take a moment to steal the subscribes button mayonnaise and replace it with horseradish. And without further delay, let's jump into the story. On the eastern edge of the Yershava Range and just west of the Sunset Beach sits the beginning of the 86-mile hiking path called Lechman Path. It is so dangerous, in fact, that the organization responsible for maintaining it implemented a 3-person traveling policy to help deter wild animals from targeting hikers. This danger didn't stop avid hikers like Michael Summers, born and raised in the bustling industrial city of Soltron. Michael's mother was a prominent materials scientist working for Slack Rock in their largest fabrication center in the region. His father, Jack Summers, was a traveling reverend until he had lost his leg while providing spiritual services to soldiers along the nation's border. This injury had led his father to becoming a stay-at-home parent, which impacted Michael's development intensely. Jack had taken to his new role with a fervor, scheduling out multiple trips around town to expose Michael to as many different real-world topics as possible. Despite all the opportunities, Michael's favorite activity was hearing his father's war stories and learning about different places Jack had toured. Michael had not wanted for much in his life, but living inside the heart of Slack Rock stripped him of the opportunity of engrossing himself in nature. The massive city was settled inside the heart of a massive quarry. He had lived a normal life until one day at school when he was 16 in geography studies. Bruno Kicken, a 46-year-old nature guide, came and offered to take the kids in the class on a weekend trip, as he had done each year for the past 14 years. Bruno had just been like all the other kids in Slack Rock, truly ignorant for the wonders that lay outside the city walls. He had left the city for the first time when he had turned 18 to provide security for a local art collector transporting goods to Embark, 50 miles away from Slack Rock. As soon as the trees surrounded Bruno, he fell in love with the sights, sounds, and smells. He loved it all and knew he wanted to learn more about this new world that had been so close to him, yet so alien. After the security detail was over, he had run to the local ranger station and signed up that day to begin his apprenticeship. He had been working as a full-time ranger for the past 28 years and a part-time educational guide for the local youth for the past 21 years. Michael, much like Bruno, had instantly fallen in love with the vibrant green leaves surrounding him and all the unique animals. Being able to sense this new fascination, Bruno made a point to show Michael all these little wondrous things that most people would find pretty dull at best. Michael, though, he loved it, and he gave his new mentor his undivided attention. They had formed a kinship over the weekend, and Michael was devastated when it was over. But Bruno had promised that he would return in a few months to guide another group of kids. Bruno passed along several books on survival, nature, and animals for Michael to read until the next time they met. Michael eagerly agreed and dashed to the library, checking out every book he had been told to read. To his credit, by the time Bruno was supposed to return, he had read all the books plus an additional 30 others, but Bruno didn't show. Hurt by this seemingly broken promise, Michael took time the following weekend to do some sleuthing and found out that Bruno had been murdered along the Lechman Path in a robbery gone wrong. He wandered to each of the local ranger stations, but no one had seen Bruno since he had left town. Michael tracked down some of Bruno's local drinking spots, and yet again, he was left empty-handed. 2 weeks had passed when Bruno had went out over the weekend to a local ranger checkpoint 5 miles from town. This single decision would shape his life, as he found out Bruno had been murdered along Lechman Path by a robbery gone wrong. This had hurt Michael in a way he had never felt before. He had finally found somebody that he was able to connect with, and it had just been taken away. So Michael promised to continue Bruno's work of showing everyone what else was out there in the world. Years passed, and at 28 years old, Michael stuck to his word. He had become a welcome face to anyone in the rager community and educators at his hometown. He had found his calling and he was happy. Michael had everything he had needed: a small flat for his stuff when he wasn't out on duty, a well-paying job that he had been promoted in several times, and got to spend time in a place that brought him peace. He had done this trip over the last 11 years and a checklist of everything that he would need and more. Headed down to the trailhead of the Lechman Path, Michael met up with 4 other hikers: Ken Turner, Simon Hart, Lisa Eastwood, and Don Newman. They were young city kids who wanted to head to Century Beach, which was at the end of the Lechman Path. Michael had been there once, but it was a little more than a party spot with copious amounts of violence, drugs, and sex, none of which had interested him in the slightest. He'd begin by asking everyone if they had packed up the gear, to which only Don had everything he had told them to bring. Michael told them the dangers of the trail again, and if they weren't going to take it seriously, then for them to leave, to which 3 of them just blew off. He gave them one last warning before beginning the long hiking path. On the first day, the group was able to make it 20 miles before the kids couldn't push themselves anymore. Michael wanted to go at least another 10 miles, but the slope path had been nice. He'd even noticed several new side trails people were starting to make. Pitching up tents beside the road was a standard hiking etiquette for this particular path. Ken left to go get some firewood around 8 p.m. while Simmons and Leah sat around talking about upcoming events at their school. Michael tasked Don to set up an alert system using some sticks and cans around their site, but Don was more interested in talking with the others. Michael knew it was a shoddy job at best, but this was a safer part of the woods, plus he didn't feel like arguing with the kids on their first night. An hour had passed and the conversations had died down, and the others started to wonder where Ken was. Michael noticed this and told him to stay put, but they ignored him, breaking off into the surrounding woods in the direction that he had taken off in. Michael started to follow, but didn't want to leave the camp unguarded in case somebody happened to come across and see an unguarded tent. A few minutes later, Michael heard a woman's scream and the sounds of bushes quickly rustling as it approached. Lisa, Simmons, and Don jumped from the bushes, out of breath, and their faces were as pale as snow. They told Michael they had found Ken covered in blood. None of them could give any more details before breaking down, but it was enough to tell Michael that Ken had been killed. He knew that if he freaked out, it would only make things worse, so he put his years of ranger experience to work setting up torches around the camp and fixing the alert trap. He knew most of the animals in this area, and that should be enough to kind of keep them away, especially with how many people were in camp. He had spent the next several hours comforting the survivors and reassuring them that they were safe, and in the morning they'd head back to the ranger station and tell everyone what happened. It was 3 a.m. and Michael was up keeping an eye on the camp. He had been only way to put the other 3 at ease enough to go to sleep. They had jumped at every single rustle and twig snap, at which point he had to go check it out. Michael sat there staring up at the stars, thinking about the moment Leah had asked him how he could be so calm in a moment like this. What he had later tell investigators would shock the entire region and the hundreds of families across the nation. Michael sat there thinking about all the animal attacks he had seen over the years. Blood-covered camps and body parts destroyed that looked like ground meat, and he knew he had witnessed it again tonight because Michael hadn't actually taken them along the main trail of Lechman Path. He'd actually taken a fork in the road that put them slightly off path, running parallel to the main trail, which would later reconnect. The deviation was so small, in fact, that it hadn't been recorded on any of the newer maps, but it would take them far enough off the popular route that they wouldn't be seen on this side path. This was one of the 13 deviations he'd wait and watch travelers breathe their last breath. As he looked up enjoying the view, a familiar shadow flew across the night sky from the north. Several minutes later, a young man ran into camp covered in blood. This was 24-year-old Lauren Wren, a recently accepted student to Sincrease Wizard Academy. He decided to hike his way to school as a final goodbye to the region. Lauren started to scream for help, but before he could, a shadow dropped from the sky and landed on top of him. An audible crunch rang out through the camp as Lauren crumpled underneath the force of the object. With a swoosh and a sweep of two large wings, the thing and Lauren was gone, leaving only a small trail of blood behind in his wake. The kids rushed from their tent, hearing the ruckus. Michael didn't move from his spot, ignoring their questions. There wasn't anything he could do. Their time had come. He had told them there wasn't any point in running. She'd need to eat. Don grabbed Leah's hand, and the two started running down the trail with Simon in tow. But before they could even leave the light of the camp, the beast came down from the sky, and with a thud and two gargled screams, it was over. Michael stood up and went over to the beast. She had cracked Don's skull open with a massive talon and was eating the gray matter of his brains. He had watched the Impervan eating, with her maroon fur glistening in the moonlight. He walked up behind her and ran his fingers gently through her long auburn hair, watching it gracefully fall toward the mid of her back. He smiled, watching her shiver at his touch. Her long, soft tail coiled around his waist, resting the heart-shaped tip at his hand. Little did Michael know a hiker had gotten lost and wandered upon the scene, seeing everything. When he had reported to the guards, Michael had been arrested and agreed to tell them everything in exchange for his pet Impervan, Bella's safety and spot in a secure wildlife preservation. When they had agreed, he had told a tale that would solve over 100 unsolved murders throughout the last 10 years. Years ago, Michael had found Bruno's killers and did get revenge for his mentor. After killing the young couple who had murdered Bruno for fun, he had stumbled upon a baby Bella that they had somehow acquired. He knew what she was and how dangerous she was, but he couldn't turn her over because he knew she'd be put down. Michael felt something click when he looked into this thing's eyes and decided to take her with him. He had fed the murderers to her first and then started feeding her wildlife, but as she grew, she started to reject the animal meat for some reason. So he did what he felt he had to. Michael started guiding people down these offshoot paths and effectively luring them to their deaths. Bella would feed and he would move on or report it as an animal attack. The court had sentenced him to death for the murders of Ken, Simmons, Leah, and Don. Bella would die weeks later in captivity from starvation as she had refused to eat after Michael's execution. The experts say that she had lost the will to live after her owner had been killed. A tragic story of a pet owner gone wrong, but it's time to close the book on the Lechman Path Murderer. If you like this story, check out the Lakeside Lamia dinner case or Roffer's River water trap video. All these stories are based on my webcomic and manga series inspired by my homebrew D&D campaign that I ran for over a decade. You can read them for free by clicking the link in the bio, and let me know what you think of this in my fan Discord, where you can also win free commissions by my team just by interacting.